In the third week of October 2009, George Papandreou, newly elected Prime Minister of Greece, in office for less than a fortnight, instructed his finance minister to release a revised estimate of the country's budget deficit. The figure that emerged was 12.5% of gross domestic product. It was, by the official account, nearly double what the previous government had forecast. It was also wrong. Not wrong in the way the previous government's figures had been wrong, understated to conceal structural problems. Wrong because it was still an underestimate. Within months, the number would be revised again, this time to 15.4%. Greece's actual debt, meanwhile, was revised upward by approximately 11%, from 269 billion euros to nearly 300 billion. The bond markets did not wait for the revisions. Within weeks of the October disclosure, the yield on 10-year Greek government bonds began widening against the German equivalent, the benchmark spread that measures how much more a government must pay to borrow compared to the safest sovereign in the eurozone. By spring 2010, Greek bonds had been downgraded to junk status. Private capital markets were effectively closed to the Greek government. What Papandreou had done was not simply reveal a deficit. He had disclosed the existence of a decade-long fiction, that Greece had been compliant with the fiscal rules of the European Monetary Union when it had not been compliant for most of its membership. The euro, the currency that 17 nations shared, the most ambitious monetary experiment in modern history, had been built in part on a lie. To understand how a member state of the European Union could misreport its fiscal position for the better part of a decade, you have to understand the structure of the eurozone's monitoring systems and their remarkable capacity to be deceived. When Greece joined the Eurozone in 2001, it had already failed to qualify under the Maastricht criteria. Its debt stood at approximately 103% of gross domestic product, against a limit of 60%. Its deficit had been held below the 3% threshold through a combination of accounting practices that European regulators accepted at face value and chose not to investigate too rigorously. The reporting system relied principally on data supplied by member governments. There was no independent auditing mechanism capable of penetrating national fiscal accounts in real time. Eurostat, the European Statistical Agency, had limited powers of investigation and depended substantially on the good faith of the governments it monitored. Good faith was not in abundant supply in Athens. The structural problems were real and long-standing. The Greek public pension system consumed over 17% of GDP by 2009, among the highest in the developed world. The public sector employed nearly a quarter of the workforce. Tax evasion was estimated at approximately 30% of economic activity. The government had borrowed heavily to fund the infrastructure for the 2004 Athens Olympics, leaving a debt legacy of 9 billion euros for an event that generated little long-term economic return. Between 2001 and 2009, as the Eurozone's single interest rate kept borrowing costs low, Greek governments of both left and right borrowed freely. Unit labor costs in Greece rose 35% faster than in Germany over the same period. The fiction that low borrowing costs reflected genuine creditworthiness could be sustained as long as nobody looked too closely at the underlying accounts. Papandreou looked. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually change the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse, the 70s oil shock, the end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. The deficit misreporting was not only a product of optimistic accounting and lax oversight. Part of the concealment involved one of the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world, and a transaction that would later become one of the most scrutinized deals in the history of European sovereign finance. In 2001, as Greece was completing its entry into the Eurozone, Goldman Sachs arranged a series of cross-currency swap transactions with the Greek government. The mechanics were complex. Greece had borrowed in dollars and yen. Goldman arranged swaps that effectively converted this debt into euros at a fictitious exchange rate, a rate engineered to be more favorable than the market rate, which had the effect of reducing the nominal value of the debt on Greece's books. The transaction shaved approximately 2% from Greece's reported deficit in the year it was executed. In exchange, Goldman Sachs received fees estimated at €400 million. The former head of Greece's public debt management agency, Christoforos Sardellis, later stated publicly that the country did not fully understand what it was buying. That admission has framed the Goldman transaction as a case of financial complexity used against a counterpart without the expertise to evaluate it. Goldman's position was that the transactions were consistent with the EU's reporting rules as they existed at the time. That both things can simultaneously be true, technically compliant and economically deceptive, is the precise mechanism that allowed the problem to persist for nearly a decade. When the details became public in 2010, German Chancellor Angela Merkel called Goldman's role scandalous. Goldman Sachs faced no fines and no legal consequences. The Greek people faced 12 rounds of austerity measures extending from 2010 to 2016. The Greek crisis did not remain Greek for long. What it exposed was not merely a problem with one member state's accounts, but a structural weakness in the architecture of the eurozone itself. The combination of a single currency with 17 separate fiscal policies, 17 separate banking systems, and no shared mechanism for dealing with a sovereign member that could no longer service its debt. By the spring of 2010, the bond markets had begun asking the same question about other Eurozone periphery nations that they had just finished asking about Greece. Ireland had guaranteed the liabilities of its collapsed banking sector in 2008, turning a banking crisis into a sovereign one. By November 2010, with its deficit reaching 32% of GDP, the highest in Eurozone history, Ireland required a €67.5 billion rescue package from the EU and the IMF. Portugal followed. Its current account deficit had been running above 10% of GDP for years, financed by foreign borrowing. When investors began withdrawing, Lisbon could no longer fund itself. By May 2011, Portugal required a rescue of approximately €116 billion. By 2012, Spain's property market collapse had produced banking losses so severe that the Spanish government could not cover them without external assistance. Cyprus's banking sector, oversized relative to the island's economy and heavily exposed to Greek debt through the 2012 private sector haircut, collapsed in 2013. France and Germany's banks held the majority of the debt that was now in question. At the start of 2010, French banks had lent approximately $53 billion to the Greek government and its banking system. German banks had lent $37 billion. The rescue of Greece was also, in critical measure, the rescue of French and German bank balance sheets. The risk was not abstract. If Greece defaulted, the losses would flow through to French and German financial institutions that were still recovering from the 2008 crisis. The contagion had the potential to transform a peripheral sovereign default into a core European banking catastrophe. On the 23rd of April 2010, Prime Minister Papandreou formally requested an international bailout for Greece. On the 2nd of May, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, the entity that became known as the Troika, agreed to a rescue package of €110 billion to be disbursed over 3 years in exchange for a program of structural adjustment. The conditions were substantial. Greece committed to €30 billion in spending cuts and tax increases. Public sector wages were cut, pensions were reduced, value-added tax was raised, state assets were to be privatized, the labor market was to be liberalized. The measures were, in aggregate, the most severe austerity program applied to an advanced economy since the debt restructurings of the developing world in the 1980s. The underlying theory was straightforward. By reducing the deficit through spending cuts and raising revenue through taxation, Greece would restore its fiscal credibility. With credibility restored, borrowing costs would fall. With lower borrowing costs, the debt-to-GDP ratio would stabilize and eventually decline. Greece would grow its way out of the crisis whilst meeting its obligations to creditors. The theory was wrong. Not wrong in every detail. The deficit did fall substantially, but the cuts in government spending reduced aggregate demand in an economy that had no monetary tools available to compensate. Greece could not devalue. It could not set its own interest rates. It had surrendered those tools when it joined the Eurozone. What remained was the blunt instrument of fiscal contraction, applied to an economy already in recession. The International Monetary Fund later acknowledged in its own review that it had underestimated the fiscal multiplier, the degree to which cuts in government spending reduce economic output. Its models had assumed a multiplier of approximately half. The actual multiplier, as the Greek recession deepened, was closer to 1.5. Every euro cut from the government's books removed significantly more than €1 from the economy. By the time Greece's third bailout package was agreed in 2015, worth €86 billion over 3 years, the Greek economy had contracted by approximately 25% since the beginning of the crisis. Unemployment had peaked at 27%. Youth unemployment had reached 60% in some periods. The country's debt-to-GDP ratio, despite hundreds of billions in rescue lending, had risen from 130% in 2009 to 180% by 2015. Austerity had not repaired the ratio. It had worsened it by shrinking the denominator faster than the debts could be reduced. The political consequences were as severe as the economic ones. In 2015, the left-wing party Syriza won the Greek general election on an explicitly anti-austerity platform. Its finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, arrived at Eurogroup meetings in an open-necked shirt and on a motorbike, conducting what he described as a game-theoretic negotiation with European creditors. Creditors described it differently. In July 2015, following a referendum in which 61% of Greeks voted to reject further austerity conditions, Syriza's own prime minister capitulated, accepting terms that were largely indistinguishable from those the electorate had just rejected. The moment that came closest to breaking the eurozone entirely arrived in the summer of 2015. With Greek banks closed for 3 weeks and capital controls in place, the possibility of a forced exit from the single currency, Grexit, in the terminology of the markets, became for the first time a real prospect rather than a theoretical one. The response that finally stabilized the situation came not from Greece's government or from the Troika, but from the European Central Bank's president. In July 2012, at the height of the broader Eurozone crisis, Mario Draghi had delivered a statement in London that has since become one of the most consequential sentences in the history of European monetary policy. Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. He then added, and believe me, it will be enough. It was. Greece exited its third and final bailout program in August 2018. At that point, the country owed the European Union and the International Monetary Fund approximately €290 billion, representing a public debt that had climbed to 180% of gross domestic product. To finance this obligation, Athens had committed to running budget surpluses through the year 2060, 42 years of fiscal constraint as the price of remaining in the eurozone. The European Union's official assessment was that the bailout had been a success. Greece had returned to growth. Its deficit had been eliminated. Its banking system had been stabilized. Its economy had begun slowly to recover. All of those things were true, also true. The Greek economy was 25% smaller in real terms than at the beginning of the crisis. Unemployment remained the highest in the European Union. Hundreds of thousands of the most educated members of the Greek workforce had emigrated, an outcome that would constrain the economy's capacity for recovery for a generation. The pension system had been cut so severely that elderly Greeks were among the most economically vulnerable populations in the developed world. The question the Greek crisis left behind was not really about Greece. It was about the design of the eurozone itself. A monetary union that creates a single interest rate for economies with fundamentally different productivity levels and fiscal disciplines will produce, as a structural consequence, the accumulation of imbalances. The low rates that were appropriate for Germany in 2003 were catastrophically inappropriate for Greece in 2006. The monetary union had no mechanism for addressing that divergence except through the crisis it eventually produced. The Greek crisis also established a precedent that the architects of the Eurozone had explicitly said would never apply, that a member state could be effectively insolvent, require external rescue on conditions set by creditors, and have its domestic economic policy determined in Brussels and Frankfurt, rather than in Athens. The no bailout clause was not honored. The principle of national fiscal sovereignty was substantially curtailed, and the people who paid the price were the Greek pensioners, the Greek unemployed, and the Greek young people who left. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments. What did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.